The snow came early that year, thick, uninvited, like a silence that pressed down on everything. Ethan Gray hadn't seen another human in 147 days. He didn't need to count, the tally was marked in the corner of his journal, a quiet ritual he performed every morning with the same black pen, same broken hand. The old ranger station he now called home sat deep in Alaska's backcountry, buried in the frozen stillness of white forests and hollow wind. He preferred it this way. No neighbors. No noise. No reminders of what used to be. Once, Ethan had been a wildlife ranger, respected, dependable, a man who understood the language of the trees better than the words of people. But after the accident, the one that took his wife, Clara, and their daughter, Lila, he left everything. His badge, his home, his voice. The cabin wasn't a home. It was a graveyard where he could walk without being seen, breathe without being judged, and sleep without having to dream of the crash. Out here, memories didn't shout. They whispered. And on most days, he had learned how to ignore them. His life had reduced to habits: chop wood, gather snow to melt, write one sentence in the journal, cook beans, feed the crows that sat like shadows outside his window. He had become something between man and mountain, cold, still, and empty. One late afternoon, while checking the last of his perimeter traps before the coming storm, he noticed something unusual: deep paw prints in the snow. Too wide to be wolf. Too clean to be moose. He crouched beside them, eyes narrowing. Bear, he muttered under his breath. It wasn't uncommon to find bears in this region, but they rarely wandered this close to the cabin, not this time of year. Most were already deep in hibernation, tucked into caves or burrows far from the open winds. He followed the tracks for a few paces, but the light was fading fast. The storm was coming. Back inside, the fire crackled softly. He lit a lantern, made tea, and stared at the single photo still left on the wall: Lila, in her red scarf, laughing on his shoulders. He hadn't laughed since. Outside, the wind began to rise, a slow howl like a wounded animal in the distance. Ethan stood, walked to the door, and checked the locks. Everything secure. No movement in the woods. Just snow and shadow. He turned back, added a log to the fire, and sat down again in silence. Then. Thump. A sound on the porch. He looked up, froze. Thump. He reached for his rifle, quietly. Another thump, heavier this time. Not footsteps. A fall. He moved slowly toward the door. Peered through the frosted windowpane. There, barely visible through the ice-blurred glass, a massive brown bear, slumped against the outer door. Blood on the snow. Breath fogging the glass. And behind her, two small cubs. Ethan remained completely still. A full-grown brown bear leaned heavily against his outer door, her massive body trembling under the weight of her injury. Blood soaked into the snow at her feet. Her eyes were dull, clouded, and her breathing had slowed into deep, labored gasps. Through the fogged window, he could barely make out the shapes behind her. Two small cubs stood close by. One of them struggled to stay upright, its movements weak and unsteady. The other nestled quietly against its mother, too tired to react to the wind swirling around them. Ethan knew exactly what he was seeing, and what it meant. Approaching a wounded predator in the wild was dangerous beyond measure. Bears, especially mothers, could become aggressive without warning. No matter how weak she appeared, he understood the risk of going near her. Interfering with wildlife in conditions like these could cost a man his life. Even if the animal looked vulnerable, it remained part of a world ruled by instinct, not reason. And in a storm like this, opening the door to something that belonged to the forest was not a decision anyone should make lightly. He reached for the rifle leaning beside the wood stove and walked slowly to the door. His breath fogged the glass as he stared into her face. She did not growl. She did not move. She only blinked. The wind howled behind her, loud enough to rattle the cabin walls. Snow swept across the porch in thick sheets, covering the cubs' paws as they clung to her. Ethan lowered the rifle slightly. The mother bear did not pose a threat. She did not carry the energy to attack. Her only strength now seemed to be her refusal to fall completely. For a moment, Ethan's mind drifted, to the crash. To the snow-covered highway. To the silence that followed the scream. He blinked hard and turned away from the door. The fire crackled behind him, and the cabin glowed warm in contrast to the icy world outside. He could shut the door, turn away, and let nature take its course. That was what most men would do. But most men had not lost what he had. Ethan returned to the window. The weaker cub had collapsed in the snow. The other stared up at him, too young to know what to ask for. He remembered something Lila, his daughter, had once said during a childhood camping trip. Animals do not knock. They wait and hope someone listens. Without another thought, he dropped the rifle and unlatched the door. He stepped outside, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders, and knelt beside the cubs. The wind struck his face like knives, but he did not flinch. The smaller cub barely moved as he lifted it into his arms. It was ice-cold, limp, and shivering. The second cub hesitated but followed when Ethan made room in the blanket. He carried them inside and placed them gently near the fire on a folded rug. They curled into each other, whimpering softly. He turned back for the mother. Her body had sunk further into the snow. Blood continued to spread from her leg, staining the storm beneath her. Ethan grabbed an old canvas tarp from the shed and began to wrap it beneath her chest. With great effort, he dragged her across the threshold, inch by inch. She did not resist. By the time she was inside, sweat had soaked through Ethan's shirt despite the cold. His arms trembled from effort. The door slammed behind him as a gust pushed against it, but he bolted it shut. The storm roared above them. Inside, the only sounds were the fire, the wind beyond the walls, and the slow breathing of the bear beside him. Ethan moved quickly. He took a clean bowl and filled it with warm water. Then he mashed dried food rations with a few spoonfuls of honey and placed the mixture in front of the cubs. One of them began to lick it. The other, still too weak, only rested its head against Ethan's boot. He used a warm towel to wipe ice from their fur. The larger cub raised its eyes to his, uncertain but calm. The mother watched. She had not moved, but her eyes followed his every action. There was no aggression in her gaze. Only exhaustion. Ethan spoke quietly, unsure why he did. "I do not know what you expect from me," he said. "But I will not turn you away." He wrapped an extra blanket around the smaller cub and poured another bowl of water. The fire burned brighter now, casting long shadows against the walls. The cabin no longer felt empty. It felt like a place holding something fragile, like a secret only the storm could understand. That night, Ethan did not sleep. He sat near the cubs, checking their breathing, making sure the fire stayed alive. The mother bear exhaled in long, shallow sighs. Her eyes never closed. And still, she did not growl. At one point, around 3 in the morning, one of the cubs stumbled to his side and pressed its head into his leg. He froze at first, unsure of what it meant. Then he rested his hand gently on its back. It did not move away. Outside, the storm continued to scream. But inside the cabin, something ancient and quiet had taken root, the kind of silence that did not feel like loneliness, but trust. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a land covered in white silence. The snowdrifts were higher than the porch rail, and icicles hung from the roof like spears. Sunlight filtered through the frosted windows, turning the inside of the cabin golden and warm. But Ethan felt no warmth inside his chest. The mother bear remained curled against the wall. Her breathing had grown weaker during the night. She had not moved since he brought her in. Her eyes were open, but barely. The wound on her leg had begun to dry, but the blood loss had taken its toll. Ethan stood near the stove, pouring boiled water into a tin cup. The cubs were asleep again, pressed close together on the rug. One of them twitched in a dream, its paw jerking toward the firelight. He looked down at the floorboards and sighed. He had broken every rule that had once defined who he was. For years, Ethan had lived by strict survival principles. He had isolated himself not out of weakness, but out of discipline. Out here, emotion could get a man killed. Compassion could open doors that should never be opened. Last night, he had done what no ranger, no hunter, no survivalist would ever consider. He had brought a predator, a wild, injured one, into his home. And now, he was responsible. Ethan knelt beside the mother bear. Her breathing was shallow, but her gaze was steady. Her strength had almost entirely left her, but she remained present. Watching. Waiting. He had seen this look before, in the mirror, after the crash. A stare that belonged to someone who was still alive only because their body had not caught up with their grief. For a moment, he reached toward her injury, hesitating as his hand hovered near her leg. The bear did not react. He pressed gently around the torn skin. There was no swelling. That was a small relief. But she had not eaten. She had not drunk any water. Her body was failing. Ethan stood, crossed the room, and retrieved a small kit from a shelf above the sink. Inside it were supplies he had not touched in years, bandages, alcohol, and a needle kit from his days as a ranger. He had always believed he would never use them again. He returned to her side and began to clean the wound. The cub stirred, watching him with wide, unblinking eyes. The bear flinched once, but then relaxed. For nearly an hour, Ethan worked. He cleaned, stitched, and wrapped. It was a rough job, but it was the best he could do. When he was finished, he sat beside her, resting his back against the cold log wall. "You are going to need strength I cannot give you," he said quietly. The bear blinked, slow and deliberate. He turned toward the cubs. They were watching him now as if they understood the room had changed, that something silent had passed between him and their mother. He knew the cubs could not survive on their own. If she died, they would either starve or be taken by wolves. He also knew that keeping them meant weeks, maybe months, of feeding, sheltering, and risking his own safety. But could he send them out there? Could he turn them away after everything? He stood and walked to the door. Outside, the wilderness had returned to calm. Snow hung on tree limbs, and the world was white and still. He stared into that emptiness, remembering what it had once meant to him. Solitude. Control. Safety. But now, it only looked like a world that had taken more than it gave. He returned inside, shut the door, and knelt beside the cubs. "I cannot undo what I did," he whispered, "but maybe I can change what happens next." He took the larger cub in his arms and placed it closer to the mother. Then he brought the food dish again, warmed a small amount of milk, and let it cool. The cub licked it slowly. It was a beginning. That evening, as the fire cracked in a slow, steady rhythm, Ethan sat near the mother bear and watched the last rays of daylight fade into shadow. The cubs lay curled beside her, their bellies full, their bodies warm. Ethan opened his journal and, for the first time in months, did not write a tally mark. Instead, he wrote one sentence. "I chose life today, not mine, but someone else's." He closed the book. The cabin felt different now. Not safer. Not more dangerous. Just fuller. He leaned his head against the wall and allowed his eyes to close. He did not know if the bear would live. He did not know what tomorrow would ask of him. But he had made his decision. And it had changed something inside him. 3 days passed. The storm was gone, but its impact remained. Snowdrifts still covered the tree-line, and ice clung to the roof like jagged armor. The air had turned clear and dry, dangerously cold at night, painfully bright during the day. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from uncertainty to fragile routine. Ethan now woke before dawn to check the fire, refill the water bowl, and prepare small rations of soaked oats and crushed protein for the cubs. They ate in silence, never far from their mother, never fully relaxed. But they ate. The mother bear had not moved in over 30 hours. Her breathing was shallow. The wound showed no sign of infection, but her strength was draining fast. She had accepted the bandages, tolerated Ethan's presence, and made no sound, but she had also refused to eat. Not even once. Ethan sat across from her now, arms resting on his knees, gaze fixed on her eyes. They were dimmer than before. Still open. Still watching. But weaker. "You need to eat," he said. She did not blink. "I cannot do this for you." She continued to breathe, barely. He placed a bowl of warm broth beside her snout and stepped back. Nothing changed. She would not touch it. She had made her choice. And he was beginning to understand it. She had not come to the cabin to survive. She had come to die, but not alone. Not in the cold. Not where her cubs would be left with nothing. She had chosen the only shelter she could find. A final act. A request without words. Ethan turned toward the cubs. They were asleep again, curled into one another beside the stove. Their breathing was even. Their fur was cleaner. They looked stronger. They had accepted this place. They had accepted him. And now he was the only barrier between them and the wilderness beyond the door. That afternoon, Ethan stepped outside for the first time in days. The sky was bright and cloudless. The forest was still, unnaturally so. The snow muffled every sound. His boots crunched softly as he walked to the shed and opened the doors. Inside were traps, snares, tools from a life he had tried to bury. A rifle. A bow. Cans of food lined the back shelves. He took a deep breath and gathered supplies. The next few hours were spent setting up a safe enclosure just behind the cabin. Using leftover fencing from an abandoned garden project, he crafted a small perimeter. It was not strong enough to hold a bear, but it would be safe for cubs, for now. When he returned to the cabin, the sun was low. The cubs greeted him with cautious curiosity. One of them approached, sniffed his coat, then retreated. The other watched silently. Ethan knelt beside them and reached out his hand. They no longer flinched. He looked over at their mother. She had not moved. Not even her eyes. He placed 2 fingers on her neck. There was a pulse. Barely. The silence in the room became unbearable. He sat beside her, head bowed, hands clenched. "I was not supposed to care," he said aloud. "That was the deal I made with myself. I live. Alone. I survive. Alone. I keep everything else out." The fire cracked. "But you came anyway." He looked at her face again, peaceful, unreadable. "And I let you in." His throat tightened. He stood and paced the room. Every part of him wanted to act, to do something. But there was nothing left to do. No medication. No rescue. No answer. He had given her shelter. She had given him a choice. And now, he had to make it. That night, Ethan did not sleep. He sat beside the cubs, feeding them in small portions. The larger one nuzzled his hand. The smaller rested its head on his boot and closed its eyes. Outside, the wind began to rise again. Ethan walked to the door, opened it just a crack, and stared into the blackness. He imagined burying her beneath the old pine tree. He imagined raising 2 wild animals in a world where nothing could be trusted. He imagined what it would cost to care, truly care, for something that belonged to the wild. And then he imagined what it would cost not to. He returned to the center of the room and sat on the floor. The firelight danced across the bear's fur. The cubs slept. Ethan stared at the shadows and waited for morning. The morning arrived without warning. There was no sunlight, no warmth, no birdsong, only pale gray clouds rolling low across the sky. The cabin's windows were fogged, and frost lined the inner corners like cobwebs made of glass. Ethan stirred before the fire burned low. He had not slept. The cubs were still nestled close to their mother, breathing softly, their small chests rising and falling with a steady rhythm. They looked peaceful. Safe. Trusting. He approached quietly, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. The mother bear no longer breathed. Her eyes had closed sometime during the night. Her body was still. The stiffness of death had begun to settle in, but she did not look disturbed. There was no fear in her posture, no suffering in her expression. She had gone quietly, on her own terms, in shelter, beside her cubs. Ethan knelt beside her and placed one hand gently on her fur. It was cold. For several minutes, he did not move. He simply sat there, listening to the silence. It was not empty. It was sacred. By noon, Ethan had prepared the sled. He wrapped the mother bear in 2 wool blankets and tied the corners with thick cord. The cubs watched from inside the cabin, restless and confused. They could smell the change. They knew something had ended. Ethan carried the wrapped body outside with slow, deliberate effort. The snow had hardened from the cold, making the pull smoother than expected. He did not look back. The forest accepted her. He chose a spot near the old pine tree, the one that stood alone near the edge of the ridge. From there, the view reached across the valley, untouched by roads or wires. It was a place she would have chosen herself, he believed. He dug until the frost gave way to soil, until his hands bled through the gloves. Then he lowered her into the earth and covered her with layers of pine branches and snow. He did not speak. Words would have lessened the moment. Instead, he stood in silence. When it was done, he returned to the cabin. The cubs were waiting at the door. They did not make a sound. Ethan stepped inside and closed it behind him. They ran to him, not with the joy of pets or the instincts of domesticated animals, but with the urgency of creatures whose entire world had changed and who now understood who had remained. He knelt down. They circled his legs. One climbed onto his lap. The other licked at the salt on his cheek. He held them both, quietly, as the wind howled once more. The days that followed became a rhythm. Ethan built a proper space for the cubs outside, a secure enclosure with shelter, straw bedding, and heat lamps powered by an old solar generator. He rotated their time between inside and outside. He fed them every few hours, slowly adjusting their diet to match what they would eat in the wild. He studied their habits. He learned their personalities. The smaller cub was quiet, observant, always moving in slow, deliberate steps. The larger one was playful, bold, curious about everything. They grew stronger with each day, more coordinated, more confident, more aware. And yet, they always returned to him. Ethan documented everything, their weight, their sleeping patterns, their behaviors. He read old field journals, watched wildlife footage stored on his hard drive, and contacted an off-grid conservationist through his ham radio to ask for silent advice. He was no longer living in solitude. He was learning to live in service. Weeks passed. The snow began to melt. Small patches of earth returned. Birds began to reappear. The forest creaked and shifted. The harsh stillness of winter slowly gave way to breath. Ethan stood at the edge of the tree line one morning with both cubs by his side. They looked out toward the ridge, their noses twitching, ears alert. He knelt beside them. "You are not mine," he said quietly. "But for a time, you were in my care. And that has changed me." The cubs did not turn. Their attention remained fixed on the trees ahead. He looked into the forest and saw something unexpected, not threat, not danger, not emptiness, but possibility. He understood that they would leave eventually. And when they did, they would carry something with them. Not just survival, but memory. That evening, Ethan opened his journal again. He flipped past the tally marks. Past the grief. Past the empty pages. He wrote. "I opened the door because something asked me to listen. I listened because something refused to die alone. I cared because I could not stop myself. And I changed because I allowed it." He closed the book. The fire crackled behind him. The cubs lay nearby, one asleep, the other watching the flames. Outside, spring was slowly waking. Inside, something else had already awakened. And this time, Ethan was ready to open the door.